well, let's start with a brief history of mission. Notice that it says a brief history of mission. We can present history in a variety of ways, so this is only one way to pay attention to the history of mission. There's a variety of ways of doing it. I just want to give a brief outline. So a broad outline would look something like this: the pre-modern era, then this chunk of time of discovery and colonialism, and then an era of what we call expansion. So the pre-modern era is a long, long time, ever since Jesus' ascension all the way to the Middle Ages, and then what follows there. Breaking it down just a little bit more, we can kind of look what happens in that first large chunk. So at some point, we start calling Christianity Christendom. And so we have mission before 313, which becomes a turning point at that time. So it starts with Jesus' command to go out. And halfway through that time period there, by about the year 180, you could pretty much already find Christians all throughout the Roman Empire. We know that there is a Christian presence in northern Africa very, very early on. We have archaeological evidence of that. We have writings of that. But one of the reasons that the spread happens so quickly is because it's actually advantageous to some degree that the Romans are there. The Romans maintained what was called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which meant that they really just did not want to have any kind of trouble. So because they always subdued any kind of uprise, you could actually travel fairly well. And so Christians benefited from exemptions granted to Jews. And so stories often of early persecution can sometimes be misunderstood. There were definitely pockets of persecution, but they were very localized. There's no empire-wide persecution at this point yet, and so Christians benefited from that in terms of being able to travel and do. Now, a little bit later on, we do see more widespread persecution of Christians, especially under Emperor Diocletian. This is when you start seeing the burning of Bible scrolls and all that. At other times, Christians were protected, such as by an edict under Edict of Milan. So moving along comes Emperor Constantine, who first is against it and then has this experience where he sees a cross in the sky and then decides that Christianity is the way to go and pretty much forces everyone to become Christian. And there's a way to grow your church. And so he pretty much tells all his soldiers to get baptized. And there goes human freedom. And so at this point, it's mandatory to become a Christian. So, going forward, there's more emperors that do stuff like that. Theodosius then makes Christianity the official religion of the empire, and there you have it, state-sponsored Christianity. Moving right along, eventually, a couple of hundred years later, the empire divides in east and west. You get a schism based on theological preferences, and Christianity kind of starts taking different trajectories. Now, in those 500 years there, between the first millennium and the Middle Ages, there's renewal of church life on all sorts of different levels. But meanwhile, the gospel spreads around the world, and that's something that you want to see. So we have Christianity in the Americas, that's both south and north, and so we see, because of colonization, right, we see activities in all sorts of areas. We see the Catholic missions taking place. We see immigrants joining in different countries. And so American colonies are Christian settlements. Then in the beginning of the 18th centuries, the West starts sending their missionaries. So we get missionaries to Africa, Latin America, Oceania, the islands there, Australia, New Zealand. And we see the formation of missionary societies and conferences, so the coming together of Christians for the purpose of missions. William Carey is well known among the Baptists. He's called the father of missions. When I was in seminary, I actually lived in a dormitory that was called Carey Hall. They also called it Scary Carey. He formed the Baptist Missionary Society. But we also see this among other denominations. And so there you have it. The World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, in Scotland, definitely made an impact. And so global Christianity starts to rise. So let's talk a little bit about that conference. 1910, so over a century ago, was a big year. For the first time, mission-minded people came together in a huge conference in Edinburgh in Scotland. We actually have a picture of it. There you have it. It's customary to trace the history of Christian mission through this conference. And the reason is because it was ecumenical. It meant different denominations came together. They pledged to take the gospel to all the nations. And so there's kind of like this before and after of that. Kind of a downside is that it was attended largely by people from the West, but it called attention to missions, and this is where academics started. So this is why today we're studying missiology in a classroom setting. So this is where the first professor of missiology was established. It also started this Western approach to missions that we still see today. Now, at this point, between the Middle Ages and the 20th centuries, you start seeing the great European migration, people moving about, and with that, they take their approach to missions. So we see a lot of Catholic missionaries, the Spanish and the Portuguese, North American missions, bring their particular missionaries around the world. So settlements in Africa, the interior of Africa, you see famous names like David Livingstone, who evangelized inner parts of Africa. Missionaries that go to India and Southeast Asia, you see names like Francis Xavier for the Jesuits, Matteo Ricci to China and Japan. Missionaries established schools and hospitals, healthcare. Missionaries really get into translating the Bible into local and tribal languages, promoting literacy, indigenous languages. People start living among people sometimes for 25 years to learn a language. Sadly, of course, we get this concept of colonial ties. So Christianity would bring with it colonialism. But you also see indigenous leadership on the rise. To counter colonialism, you see independent church movements rise. And in recent years, we have seen demographic shifts. So we now see more missions happening in the southern region of our globe. We see more ecumenism, denominations working together, and different types of missionary movements. So it's all very exciting. So we've made progress. We also face challenges. The later 20th century saw, shifts in world order. The wall came down in the east. Communism fell down. The great European migration kind of ended. Kind of the mainline missions kind of declined. Now we see more evangelical missions. We saw innovative missions. Wycliffe is a large Bible translator, translated numerous Bibles into people's native tongue. MAF, Mission Aviation Fellowship, trained pilots. I used to work for a university in Northeast Texas that trained pilots, and a lot of our pilots went to work for Mission Aviation Fellowship, where they would supply missionaries who lived out in remote areas with resources. So that helped, and other indigenous works. Denominations would bundle their efforts through cooperative programs, the Foreign Mission Board, International Mission Boards, Then the formation of ministries that worked alongside denominations or outside of it, like InterVarsity, Campus Crusade for Christ, Youth with a Mission, World Vision, Pentecostalism, and charismatic movements are on the rise, uh, including in the Catholic Church under the Vatican II in the 70s and Pope John Paul II. Um, and so, great things. So we can come up with a major turning points list in the history of Christian missions. Of course, it starts with Jesus and the Great Commission. And then, like we mentioned, you see a lot of different turning points under different emperors. Definitely important to point out the monastic missions between the 5th and 9th centuries, where you get monasteries being formed and people really living among the people. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, important for the formation of different trajectories in Christianity, but for a while, with the strong emphasis on Calvinism, kind of subdued missions. Baptist missions start in the 17th century and continues. And then we see a modern mission movement with emphasis on contextualization, seeing the context within which the methods of Jesus is to be presented. We definitely see a challenge of globalization and urbanization and move to the cities. We will, in this course, really pay attention to the rise in Pentecostalism and charismatic movements around the world, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. And, technology and communication has really affected how the gospel is spread. And so, exciting times. We also sadly see a lot of displaced peoples, which means the formation of diaspora missions. And then in our own context, more and more people who no longer feel comfortable in organized religion. And so that completes our looking at that aspect of church history.